The year is 21 Ante-Laurentium. The Battle of Southvale has resulted in the sound defeat of the native Aladir peoples. Despite their numerical advantage and superior training, the advanced steel armor and artillery of the Frostock regiments under the WOC has resulted in mass casualties for the Aladir. With Auckton Island and much of southern Tarath now solidly under the control of King Edward the Magnanimous, investment has flowed in from the homeland. Thus, as hundreds of more people arrive, the colony begins to finally turn a profit for the WOC for the first time. Large cotton plantations have begun to ship the materials required to fuel the manufactories back on the home isles. This, along with a new merchant class, other crop farming, and a logging industry taking advantage of the strong native oaks, have allowed the colonies of Auckton Island to begin sending materials back home at a high rate, exporting more than it receives in imports for the first time. King Edward was overjoyed at this news. However, the natives were not eliminated from the island. Rather, they were simply pushed away to the fringes, away from the large river plain that the Frostock colonies are built atop. Being relegated to small coves, inlets, and rare flat valleys, the Aladir of Auckton began a low-level insurgency, attacking trade ships, wagons carrying goods, and occasional raids on frontier towns. It was clear to Edward that simply defeating the natives was not enough. Thus, using the profits generated by the colonies, Edward funded the construction of the newest and largest fortification yet built in Tarath, Fort Auckton. Both to secure the island and the straits, Fort Auckton would be the largest symbol of power and authority yet seen in Auckton. It would defend the colonies not just from the natives, but also from other greedy powers that would seek to cash in on their own colonial endeavors. This is where we begin Episode 5. Welcome to Auckton. Heyo everyone, it's been a little while. As you might have seen on my update video, I went away for a little while just to get away from college and, hang out with my friends and get away from everything for a little while. But I am back and starting up Episode 5 with another sort of renovation of the existing cities and towns. So we start here in Southvale, redoing the cathedral. I never quite liked the original asset that I used for these small churches. But now with the growth of the cities into large proper towns in their own right, I decided to give them another once-over. I replaced the asset with this now much larger masonry building, and I do the same over here with the other towns as well. Here in New Wolverhampton, I use the same asset and situated here right on this market square, which I will also be redoing here shortly. I enclose it with that iron fence and, just add some flowers and graves and whatnot, just to give it a little detail. These sorts of religious structures would have been centers of the community in their own right, and also large, financiers of local renewal projects, including what I'm working on here, the first large colonial, or government administration in these colonial settlements. I believe this is a Dutch town hall, actually. So I place it down here and I start moving around houses and other buildings just to be able to situate it here better. With how large and prominent this building is and how new and nice it is, I decided to actually properly give it a little courtyard around it, just to give it a little more prominence in the area. We are currently in Auckton in about the equivalent of the mid-1600s. As a result, these sorts of large public works projects would have been more possible than they would have been at the establishment of these settlements. No longer are the colonies just focused on survival. Now they have moved into properly self-sustaining economic engines of their own right, and as such kind of need their own local administrations. They can't just be governed from the homeland. The WOC, the West Odresh Company, would be subsuming a lot of local governments, running these towns as businesses, essentially. Um, so, while the local government likely wouldn't be very powerful, it would still exist. As another kind of testament to how much these renewal projects are changing the landscape of these towns, I'm redoing the central square of New Wolverhampton. I didn't have a good fountain asset, and this is a recurring theme, but I don't like having to quit the game just to download one new asset. So instead of adding a large central fountain, I'm instead reorganizing these market stalls to just kind of take up the new space. The original shop hall has been, gotten rid of, but instead a lot of these new, I suppose, shops right in front of the colonial administration, which would make for a very, I suppose, lucrative shop front. I also, add a couple of these little planters right here in front of, or beside the administration building. I'm not sure if that's anachronistic or not, but regardless, it looks nice, so I just went with it. As always, then I start placing around these little dirt decals. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that I can get them to overlay on top of the cobblestone decals. But, it is what it is. It looks nice regardless. Still in Wolverhampton here, as, to show even more development, I begin to expand the port here. There's not much to say. I've never been much of a detailer, so more or less I just fix the terrain here, drag out the docks, and call it a day. So, why did it take so long to produce this episode? Not only was I gone for a trip for a long time, but it took me a while to figure out how to do this episode to begin with, as it covers a lot of sensitive topics that we'll get into later. Right now we're focusing on the city itself. I also just placed down that little cargo dock in order to allow cargo ships to actually come in and out. But here you see I begin to expand out the plantations and houses, or farmlands around New Wolverhampton. So, this episode already was off schedule by the time I made my announcement post last week. And that's because it covers slavery. With the Native War that was covered in the last episode, we were bound to reach this point eventually. And the Spanish New World in our timeline, the Spaniards brutally utilized the native peoples of the New World. For example, there are almost no native people, I believe it was the Taino people, on Hispaniola, that is modern day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Because of this exploitation of the native population, the populations under New Spain were decimated, not just from disease, but from overwork and the brutality of the Spaniards. And the British were not much better. Of course, Auckton is modeled after a British colony. As a result, it's very difficult to sort of convey these sorts of settings and work conditions in a City Skylines series without it being incredibly controversial. I feel like the notion of me making a City Skylines city that even has slavery in it is controversial in and of itself. The goal of this series is to explore a fictional world that models our own. And unfortunately, one of the darkest chapters of our own world is modern slavery. So this episode is actually the first one with these time-lapse playthroughs that has been partially scripted. I'll jump into some, pre-written I suppose, parts later on. But as I work on this first cotton plantation, you can see that I'm trying to just convey the scale of these plantations. Most previous farmlands were for subsistence. They would grow food to feed themselves and sell whatever excess they had to townspeople in the marketplaces. There were, of course, cotton plantations before, but nothing to this scale. This is a massive plot of land owned by an extremely wealthy landowner for the sole purpose of producing and exporting a cash crop. It wasn't just cotton. Cotton is the only large field I have here, simply because City Skylines doesn't have other cash crops like sugar and tobacco. But these cash crops were pretty much the main reason the colonies existed in the first place. New World colonies really struggled to get off the ground as the resources were more explored, and the homelands realized that these lands weren't filled with gold. They weren't teeming with exotic resources. Instead, they were, for the most part, just normal places that had a native population already there. It was costly to develop in the New World because most people and materials had to be shipped over from the Old. And for a very long time, these colonies were not profitable. New Spain lucked out, really, in the colonial game, with their native conquests and the discovery of large natural quantities of gold and silver. I mean, hell, Argentina is literally named after the large silver mines in the area. However, not everywhere was this resource rich. Of course, everybody knows about the Western America, the gold mines of Nevada and California, but that wouldn't come until much later. The areas of the West were not explored until the coasts weren't even mapped until around the late 1600s to 1700s. So, why did the Old World invest so much in the colonies? While there weren't many raw mineral resources, things like tobacco, sugar, whatnot, were quickly discovered to grow extremely well there. Hell, if I recall correctly, tobacco is an Old World plant. So these goods, I suppose you could call them, were very quickly realized to have immense monetary value. But with the native population being so heavily depleted, it was... How do I word this? The native population was heavily depleted, and working on the fields was extremely laborious and taxing for anybody. So rather than having to pay large amounts of money to make English people work these fields, the large plantation owners and large landowners of the time realized it was simply cheaper to import forced labor. So, slavery is the ultimate result of a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation. I am not a slavery apologist. I believe it was an extremely unjust and cruel chapter in history. But slavery is also, unfortunately, instrumental to the creation of modern history as we know it. It was not profitable to landowners to hire freedmen to work these plantations. And as a result, if slavery were not a thing, it's very unlikely that the Old World would have invested as much as they did into a colony like the ones in North America without this sort of economic backbone. So, it was simply cheaper to own individuals, robbing them of their personhood, than to pay the willing workers. This terrible practice continued to make landowners even more wealthy, not only increasing the profits, but the amount of slaves. However, as a result, the amount of product increased, but so too did the amount of slaves. Made through the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of people being forcefully relocated, this barbaric practice ultimately resulted in the Industrial Revolution, as the manufacturers of the Old World sought to more efficiently and easily refine the raw goods produced by the hands of slaves. This is the birth of capitalism. It was only profitable to fund these colonies with slave labor. Without it, it's unlikely that large amounts of materials would have been produced to begin with. So, with the drive in the New World to more efficiently refine those goods for cheaper, it became economically profitable to fund the invention of new forms of manufacturing, such as the water wheel and eventually the steam engine, specifically in English textile mills and whatnot. So, the birth of capitalism out of slavery was a merciless ideal to increase profits and efficiency. That ultimately made slavery obsolete, as more efficient machines and advanced machinery awoke the public consciousness regarding workers' rights. Thus, the abolitionist movement was born. So, without slavery, it is unlikely the Industrial Revolution would have begun as it did, and as a result, we would never have achieved the delicate balance between workers' rights and exploitation, frankly, that we see today. I don't need to keep repeating this, but slavery was an awful, awful chapter in history. But it's, in my opinion, unlikely that without slavery, we could have achieved the Enlightenment that eventually led to the abolition of slavery and modern multiculturalism as it is today. I don't believe that slavery is a good thing whatsoever. I do not intend to make this series to be an apologist. I want to depict a fictional history that mirrors our own. Modern society, in my opinion, was resultant from slavery. The development of a landowning class, especially in the southern United States, which Auckton is based on, would always have wanted to try to increase their profits somehow. And most likely would have always tried to create a cheap workforce in order to achieve this aim. So, without that, without the cash crops, without the exploitation, to me, it's unlikely we could have achieved what we have today and become a multicultural society. As a result, modern society is resultant from slavery. And today we stand on the shoulders of those millions who worked for their entire lives against their will, being taken from their homes by powers that simply aim to exploit them. And modern society is frankly forever in their debt. That was heavy. So what have I been up to in Auckton? Well, while I was busy talking about that, trying to discuss why I'm including slavery in Auckton, I did a large renovation of New Lockport, as you saw earlier, with those large retaining walls. I'm also beginning this large star fort. Star forts were used frequently in the colonial period to enforce an empire's claim to an area. So we've already seen that the Frostock Kingdom will use everything in its power to keep Auckton under its control, being situated on these straits as a bridge between East and West Tarath. It is an extremely strategically valuable area. So these star forts not only serve to keep Auckton under the control of the Empire from the Eladir people, who are still active and still fighting a low-level insurgency, but also from other colonial powers. The Frostock Kingdom, of course, had a head start compared to the others. Um, they were the first to be alerted of, the receding ice. And they were the most seafaring people who already had access to the vessels required to follow the coastlines all the way over to Tarath. But other colonial powers are quickly catching up. While the Kingdom of Frostock is, of course, an analog for England in this timeline, the Spanish were the ones with that head start in our timeline. The Portuguese developed the caravel, and with that opened up the seas to the Europeans. But the Spaniards were the first to actually get to the New World. And as a result, they were the first to be able to exploit it. They were able to stake their claim first, and of course everybody knows about the Treaty of Tordesillas. And as a result, Spain was given the lion's share of the New World, and any good Catholic country was meant to respect that Spain's the Western Hemisphere was Spain's hemisphere. Of course, we later found out that the South America goes a lot further east than they had originally anticipated, and now, of course, Portugal colonized Brazil. But regardless, the point is that colonial powers were quickly able to stake their claims on the New World. That doesn't mean that they didn't have to defend them. Britain, the Netherlands, Sweden, and France, of course being a Catholic power, all eventually ignored the Treaty of Tordesillas, and staked their own claim in the New World. These competing powers were always at odds with one another. Colonial territories, once it was figured out how to make them profitable, were heavily in competition. New Sweden was eventually conquered by New Netherlands, and then New Netherlands was conquered by New England. New England grew into the 13 colonies, and the 13 colonies grew into the United States. The Old World powers would be extremely incentivized to guard their colonial holdings. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm building this large star fort, which, as you can see, is mostly aimed toward the coastline, with Auckton being in such a strategically important strait. If Frostock can hold on to this strait, they essentially have first dibs on the entire interior of the Sapphire Sea. So, as a result, you can see that's why there's two large stone rings toward the sea, whereas on the interior it's only these two prongs and what I'm about to build here, a wooden palisade. These star forts would be extremely well defended. Essentially, the design of a star fort makes it to where nobody can really approach the wall of a star fort without being seen. There is no angle in a properly designed star fort that cannot be approached without a gun being able to be pointed directly at you. That makes them almost nigh impenetrable by frontal assault. You instead have to just wait them out. And as a result, the interior of these star forts would become communities in their own right. Especially in the old world, entire cities would be built within these star forts. This is a very small fort here that I'm building now. So the interior of this fort is mostly going to be dedicated to barracks and troop whatnots. You know, I'm of course not a historian. I'm not a military engineer by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, so most of the interior of this fort is dedicated to training grounds, barracks, and everything required to supply a large regiment of soldiers. So here, what I'm building here on the edge, this would be like officers' quarters, where the general or commander of the fort lives, along with stables, storehouses, and whatnot. The interior walls of these forts would not just be there simply for defense. They would be used as storehouses for ammunition and supplies. So those doors that are merged into the fort are likely genuine access ports into interior stockrooms. I didn't have a stable asset, unfortunately, so instead I put the horses under these little huts, which I honestly think is awesome. Just a little bit different than our world, I suppose. I'm really proud of that. I built a mess hall under that big hut in order to, feed the soldiers. So these garrisons would be extremely well stocked. So as a result, I placed, crates and whatnot all over the place. You can see them there up on the actual walls of the fort. There are a few crates just by the cannons, along with soldiers manning their stations. This is a little training field, and then I start placing these soldiers just all over the place, just to give a little more life to the area. So yeah, no, I'm just in the process now of placing down all these soldiers. Of course, real soldiers of this time period would be wearing more cloth-based uniforms, but again, I don't really have the assets for it. You can see there off camera that I placed down a little place to rope your horse to. So yeah, like I said earlier, these areas would be... a lot of these forts acted as entire towns unto themselves. So within the palisade wall, I placed down a couple of little homes and whatnot for likely either base commanders or rich merchants. As it would guarantee a level of safety that just would not be possible outside of the walls. With this being roughly equivalent to the 1650s roundabout, masonry, especially brick masonry, would be more common, so this sort of architectural style is finally more acceptable than it was earlier. So, as the actual builder, woohoo, I get to use brick buildings finally. I'm just going around now with these texture brushes just to give a little more, I suppose, life to the settlement. That's a ongoing thing, with these dirt decals, with the dirt texture. I'm just trying to roughen everything up, because nothing is actually pretty like this in real life, especially when it's in use. So, naturally, of course, the people manning the space would be very cautious about trees and whatnot, because they would want a clear line of sight for as far as possible. However, I figured they would allow these bushes to grow, since it both slows down people, and having an area that's not manicured, it just makes things easier in terms of maintenance. So, I mentioned how entire towns would spring up by the fort, but these forts were also city generators in and of themselves. Merchants would come, to sell to the soldiers. Farmers would then come to sell to the merchants. The farmers would sell their produce at local markets. Cheap produce means it's easier to live there, so more merchants would come, and so on, until these forts spawned entire cities. It's only been about 20 years since the last episode, and I did it earlier while I was, still talking, but you can see how grown over the old battlefield has become. So, with only about 20 years passing since the war with the native peoples, and this fort being established somewhat soon after, this settlement has grown extremely rapidly. And as a result, you can see there's not really a lot of, city planning going on. This is a very quick and rough settlement, and its downtown core, you can see there, is only really starting to develop. This city, Fort Auckton, will be mostly low-density development. Of course, the houses, like you see here, will be very out the suburbs of New Lockport. They'll be very close together, but instead of a dense, commercial core, it'll be mostly focused on small single-family homes scattered all over the place, along with large farms and plantations around that. Speaking of plantations, that is one of the main reasons of this fort existing. Of course, it's to guard the settlement from, other colonial powers and the natives, but it's also to guard the production of these colonies. Because of how much money the plantations make for both the wealthy landowners and for the manufacturing owners of the homeland, the crown would have a vested interest in keeping this production safe, and as a result would dedicate large amounts of money to building these defenses to keep the good imports continuing back to the homeland. But yeah. Everything comes back to exploitation, doesn't it, unfortunately, with colonies. So yeah, the crown would develop these forts, in essence, to protect the wealthy landowners from natives, other colonial powers, and, in some cases, the colonies themselves. Because of how much investment is going back into the landowning elite, like I mentioned in a couple episodes ago, life for the average colonist is rather grim. Most people are simply there to try to flee like the European analogs, the people from Turla in this universe. They're mostly originally attracted there for the promises of wealth and freedom. Of course, the saying goes, God, glory, and gold. But yeah, for the average person, you would mostly just be working your little plot of land in a garden or raising livestock, and your quality of life would pretty much not improve in your entire lifetime. It would only come later when children of people actually had a chance at improving. They're reasonably having a chance at improving their situation. It was almost unthinkable to think that you would be living better than your grandfathers would in this time. But yeah, as usual, I just go through with fences. There's a police car, ignore that, I switch out the vehicle. Fences and dirt are, of course, a very good way to add detail pretty quickly to a build. I then go through with trees. Trees are, of course, another wonderful way of adding detail. It's the city skylines, patented tool to cover up all your mistakes. Just plop down a bunch of trees. You can also see there I made a large cathedral with a half-empty graveyard because this settlement is very young. But yeah, that's more or less the town of Fort Auckton done. Now I begin on its outskirts by making these plantations. Like the plantation in New Lockport, I really want to convey the just mass scale of these things. Most people who own a farm will only likely manage a small plot of land, whereas these plantation owners hold large swaths of land and manage large fields of cotton, and usually other crops as well. So, for example, I placed down this large livestock field and then a little plot of corn. I say little, but that plot of corn is about as large as the farm's got beforehand. I also placed down those small houses with the thatch roofs as, unfortunately, slave dwellings. While the landowner would live well in that large plantation home at the head of the estate, slaves, of course, were relegated to small subsistence. That's not the right word. Small basic dwellings that would keep the rain off their heads, but not offer much else in terms of comfort. Of course, some people still wanted to cash in on the cotton craze, as it were. So, this property I sectioned off as a small landowner, perhaps even a freedman, who is growing their own cotton and livestock to sustain themselves. This I'm working on now is another large plantation estate. I fence it off here just to show the property boundaries. The terrain here is a little wild, so I actually do struggle a little bit. I'm not super happy with how this plantation home looks, but you know, it's a large brick estate, so I suppose it looks alright. I don't have any good assets at the moment for those sort of large southern plantation homes that we have in Louisiana. So instead I'm doing, I suppose this looks more like East Coast plantations. However, I do place down these large live oaks, which are almost ubiquitous, especially on the front drive of southern plantations. So yeah, more cotton, more houses. I add in some more live oaks just to, you know, spice it up, make things look a little interesting. Yeah, this property is a little smaller than the other property, so I imagine there might be even like a large family rivalry between the two estates about, you know, who's better. Good old southern drama. To show just the wealth and magnitude of these estates, I also placed down those hedges, as you saw. Just continuing on with the outskirts of Fort Auckton, I'm just placing down a couple of smaller farming estates and whatnot. Some of them grow cotton, some of them grow actual, you know, food crops, but regardless, as you get toward the edge of the city, things become a lot more rural as farms and forests take over. But yeah, I believe we are approaching the end of the episode. I really hope you did enjoy despite the heavy topics discussed in here. The goal of this series is to, you know, show off a city through history, and unfortunately we have to cover the darker parts. So, as we head into the cinematics, please like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon. And if you have any feedback, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. Have a good one.